Hello, welcome to my channel, Edible Thoughts Makes. My name is Stephanie, and today I have a little episode for you where I wanted to talk about swatching. Now, I am not here to tell you whether to swatch or not to swatch. That is really up to you. And sometimes I do it and sometimes I don't. But let's back up a little bit. What is a swatch? So a swatch, or at least a fabric swatch, is a small piece of fabric that is knit or crocheted up before starting a project for various reasons. And today I want to talk about 5 different things that I get out of a fabric swatch. And the most, common, or the most common reason somebody might swatch is for gauge. And that is something a lot of people talk about before starting a project, especially a garment, so that you have a better idea of which size to pick and how it will turn out. So I will talk about 5 different things that I look for in a swatch, and I have a pile of swatches in front of me from years of knitting and making. I think these ones are all my knit swatches, and I don't usually do swatching for crochet. I think because a lot of my crochet items, I don't necessarily follow a pattern directly, and so I can just kind of make things up as I go. But for this pile in front of me, they are all knit swatches, and I will share them, at least some of them, with you as examples for going through the different points that I want to discuss today. So the first one is gauge. I am not going to tell you how to knit a gauge swatch. That is something that is all over the internet and things that you can find elsewhere. But primarily, a measurement is for how many stitches per inch. And in most patterns, it will say how many stitches for 4 inches, or I believe that's 10 centimeters. So to knit a proper gauge swatch, it's usually recommended to have that swatch be 6 by 6 inches. And that way there's room for a border edging so that the edges might not curl on itself. And also, if there are any stitches that might be a little wonky on the edges, we don't measure those ones. We measure more from the center. Whether or not you decide to knit a 6 by 6 inch gauge swatch is up to you. I would say mine range, it kind of depends. And so I will generally do a garter border around the edge so my edges don't flip. And depending on the pattern, a lot of times they'll recommend that you knit a gauge swatch in the round or flat, depending on the item that you're making. Knowing myself as a knitter, I have pretty even tension between my knit stitches and my purl stitches, so I generally knit all my swatches flat, and for color work ones, I will knit that in the round and just carry a strand around the back and then move my needles down and then keep knitting. So I'm only knitting, not purling. If you find yourself rowing out, which is when your purl stitches are a lot looser than your knit stitches, and if you look on the back of your fabric, that row will be a little bit longer, then you will know that your purl stitches are a bit looser than your knit stitches. And that doesn't happen for me. I'll show you, here's a flat swatch here, and the back is very even. So the back will be basically reverse stockinette. There are no rows that seem particularly longer than the other. So this would be a swatch knit flat. Let me see if I have a swatch. Here's one that's knit in the round, so it's a color work one, and the edges are fringy because they were carried along the back and then cut through. Now if there's yarn that you think you might need to use at the end, just don't cut it. Leave very long floats, and then if you have to unravel your swatch to use that yarn in your project, you still can, because once it's cut, you can't really reuse the yarn because it's in a bunch of little pieces. So yes, we knit to figure out the gauge, and I've mentioned this in a different video, which I'll link to here, that I put a tag with all my swatches, and on there I'll write what needle size I used, what the yarn is, what the fiber content is, and then I'll also include my gauge that I measured on it. So here is an example of one on the screen. But yes, so I like to include all that information and attach it. Sometimes it will be the actual tag from the yarn, And so instead of just tossing or recycling that, I can attach that and write whatever notes I need to write on there and have it attached to the swatch. I do like to keep my swatches because they are good references and they can be great inspiration as far as looking at color combinations, or, oh, remember that time when I made that, you know. This one has a bunch of marling, which I will talk about later too, but it was a play with different colors here, which I'll also talk about. So yes, I'm getting ahead of myself, but just to round that out, gauges, fabric swatch size, about 6 by 6 inches, and it's a way to count how many stitches you have per inch, to know if it matches up with the pattern that you're following or not, and if it doesn't, do you need to go up a needle size, down a needle size, switch things up, or do you just go with the one that you got and then adjust which size you pick accordingly. Okay, next is fabric, drape, and structure. So once I knit it up, whether or not it's at the gauge that the pattern calls for, do I like it? Is this something that I want to have as a drapey fabric, or is it something that I want more structure? And if I want more structure, then I want my fabric to be denser. And if I want it more drapey, then I'm going to want more air and fluidity in my fabric. So here is an example of a fingering weight held with a lace weight yarn, and it has more holes or gapiness to it, and it is very drapey, very soft, very lightweight. Whereas, where's the other one I'm looking for? Maybe a worsted weight yarn that is knit with a smaller needle than it typically might be used for. Nope, that's not it. Well, here's another holy one. This one has a lot of holes in it, and it's very ethereal, and it has some halo to it, so it fills in some of the gapes or gapiness in between. Oh, here's the one I was looking for. This is a worsted weight yarn, knit with a smaller needle than I would typically use for a worsted weight yarn, so it has more structure to it, which I wanted because there are details that are in this pattern that I want to have it be something that it can hold up for itself versus something that's super, super drapey. The next thing I want to talk about is color play. So a swatch can help you determine what colors you might want to knit next to each other, or what colors you decide you don't like next to each other. A lot of times we will do color work, and let me see if I can find a color work swatch here. Here's one. And maybe you want to find out if it's high contrast or low contrast. And sometimes you can tell just by looking at it, and other times people will put their yarns next to each other before knitting the swatch, take a picture, change it to black and white to see if the colors have enough contrast or if they all look gray next to each other. And so this one is very high contrast with the purple and then this rusty orangey brown and then a cream color. But this is a swatch, and this one is in the round. So it's all in the round without having to cut any yarn. It's just knit completely in the round. Here's another swatch that plays with color combinations, and what's great about this is then you can see what colors go next to each other, maybe what colors you don't want to go next to each other, if you want to switch your color assignments for the different contrast colors. So here is one, and this one I knit in the round and then had the yarn carried across the back, and then I did cut it. So here's one. Let's see if I have any other color play. Here's another one for stripes, playing with like a more solid or tonal and then a highly variegated yarn. And this one has this pearl bump across the middle with these holes on the top indicating I used 2 different needle sizes for each side. And so this one would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This one used a US 6 on this side. And then this one used a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, a US 7 on this side. And I think also with color play, aside from contrast and seeing what colors you like next to each other, it can also help you determine a color story. So maybe I wanted something that was like warm neutrals, So then I might have this like grayish brown fawn color with like a light peachy pink and a rusty peachy color. Or maybe I want something a little more, what's another one that has different colors? Well, this one has 3 different colors on here. So 2 different speckly yarns, one's more lavender, one's more gray, and then there's this dark purple here, so maybe that's the color story I want to go with. Some soft purpley lavender colors. Next is mixed and match. So a lot of times I'm talking about marling for mix and matching, and for that I want to know how different colors might play together. This one has more of a cream yarn that had neon speckles, and then I marled in these different mini skeins that were neon with speckling. So I wanted to see how those would play together, and they created this nice, not quite a fade, but just like marled neon speckly stripes. This one I showed earlier, and I wanted like a watercolored effect, and I played around with like warm and cool colors that are held together. And that was a fun way to play with marling and playing with colors going together. And do I have any more? Here's another one. That's marled yarns for more of an earthy palette. And this can be a way to play with color and fiber dominance if you're playing with yarns that have different fiber content, like mohair and Surrey plus a merino or something like that, just to get a sense of how the fabric will feel and how it will look. The last one I wanted to mention is stitch exploration. So swatching is a great little canvas to play with different textures and play with different, what do you call it? Can't think of the word, but playing with like a stitch dictionary to figure out different combinations of knit and purl stitches basically. Or if you're playing with cables, or maybe you're trying a new to you yarn that you're not sure how it will look in lace, or how it will look in twisted stitches, or things like that, or even in stockinette. But it can be a way to play with stitch exploration. Here is one. Here's a swatch I did for a shawl, and it has this really cool plaid patterning and different colors that are used throughout. And so this swatch allowed me to practice that stitch pattern and also learn a new technique. And then I could practice on a smaller scale versus casting on for a big project and then potentially getting frustrated if something wasn't working and having to rip the whole thing out. So this is an example of one stitch practice or stitch exploration. Here is another one that has the different stitch pattern on there, and then I just continued with the stockinette on the bottom so I could do my stockinette gauge there, but then also try out my color combination and stitch patterning. So I hope that was helpful and maybe gives you some ideas of what you can look for when you're swatching, or maybe something to think about when you are choosing whether or not to swatch for a project. I have this beautiful pile of swatches that I have just kept over the years in a drawer, and every once in a while I'll go through it and look for ideas or color combinations, or see if there's a certain yarn that I might want to use again, and what gauge did I get last time. And of course your own tension can change over time as well, but it gives me something to go off of. And perhaps I am looking to use a certain yarn for a different project and I want to know how it worked out last time before I swatch again, maybe on different needles, to see, just to give myself something to go off of. So I hope that was helpful and interesting to you. Happy knitting!